distinct privilege for me to introduce to you the person that has given us economic stability for 8 years and changing the world right now. Let us all welcome the 42nd President of the United States, ladies and gentlemen, Bill Clinton.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the welcome. I want to thank my great friend Phil Christopher, who, in addition to his wireless career, is America's most dogged advocate for a solution to the divisions in Cyprus. And Dick Holbrooke and I, when I was president, and I think Dick Holbrooke was the most accomplished American diplomat since World War II. Did everything we could with Phil Christopher, and he was always beating on me to do more to resolve that. We didn't resolve it, but we got caught trying. And a lot of life is getting caught trying. Phil Christopher is a guy who always gets caught trying, so I thank him for the introduction. I want to thank Rob Messerow and Steve Larsen for giving me a chance to see you again. I was here with President George H.W. Bush at this convention in 2007, and I never will forget it. We were taken around in a golf cart together to all the exhibits, and we left with the biggest goodie bag I ever got speaking at any convention. I thought I should have paid for the privilege of collecting all the latest technology, which my daughter explained to me after I got home. I also want to say a special word of appreciation to Steve Larsen. You know, I'm a big football fan, and I was totally intimidated when Steve Larsen became a Republican congressman from Oklahoma, and I realized he was my opponent. And then I got to like him because he was always so totally straight and totally honorable. And disagreements are good if you have people who are really talking to each other and treating each other with respect. But I was kidding Steve backstage. He got a degree at Tulsa in biology. And so I got interested in science in my dotage as I got older, but I keep up with the latest scientific developments. And last year there was one in biology that explained to me how we're just hardwired to fight. So our contests were inevitable. Last year, the latest discovery in the Human Genome Project, which was, the human genome was first sequenced in 2000. I spent a lot of your tax money to get that done. Because I thought it would show us the genetic variances which make, we already know, women more vulnerable to develop breast cancer, for example. We're getting close on unraveling the mysteries of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. But last year the big discovery was that unless your ancestors are 100% descendant from sub-Saharan Africa, which includes nearly nobody, including any African Americans, 100% descendant from sub-Saharan Africa, between 1% and 4% of your genome comes from our pre-human ancestors, the Neanderthals. Because people got out of Africa somewhere between 90 and 120,000 years ago and spread across the earth. And we shared the earth for about 40,000 years with the Neanderthals. And they were bigger than we were, stronger than we were. Their brains were about as big as ours, but they didn't learn to communicate and they couldn't run as fast. So we survived and they didn't in an era of giant animals, which preyed on people and living things that look like people. But it turned out the Neanderthals and the humans liked each other a little better than we knew, and there was some crossbreeding, so we're all part Neanderthal, which is why we fight, partly. My wife and daughter thought this was no big deal. They already knew But they were stunned to find out that they were too. Anyway, I'm glad to be here. And I was thinking about listening to the film again, how different my life is now than it was in the years I was in politics. I worked with the first President Bush in the aftermath of the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, and then after Katrina here in New Orleans, where we raised a lot of money to try to help rebuild the city. And then President George W. Bush and I worked together in Haiti to raise money to do all kinds of things. I'll say a little more about that in a minute. And I get ragged by some of my Democratic friends to say, all you do is work with Republicans now. I said, half the time I don't even know who I'm working with. And I still am a member of my party. I'm doing what I can to help the president, whose re-election did. And I supported my wife very strongly when she ran. But here's what bothers me about the modern world. This agreement is good. Nobody's right all the time. And a broken clock is right twice a day. And all of us are condemned to live our lives in that netherworld of being never right all the time, and most of us are going to be right more than twice a day. So diverse opinions are healthy and disagreement is good. But if your goal is to win a victory through protracted conflict, it may work in politics, but it doesn't work in real life. What works in real life are creative networks of cooperation. People who take advantage of their different knowledge, their different experiences, their different understandings, their different philosophies even, to figure out how to cooperate to move forward on this or that or the other challenge. And if you think about it, the business you're in created more new networks of knowledge and cooperation than any single development in human history all around the world. So that's the main point I want to make. Somehow we have to make our politics at home and around the world more like what we know works in real life. And I could give you a lot of examples, but the bottom line is America is in the aftermath still of first a decade of very slow job growth, and then this financial collapse accompanied by a mortgage collapse, in fact triggered by a mortgage collapse. And if you look back 500 years, whenever any country has a financial collapse, it normally takes 5 to 10 years to get back to full employment. In the last couple of hundred years, when buildings have been owned privately by companies and individuals, if there's a mortgage collapse and a financial collapse, it normally takes 10 years to get back to full employment. In Japan, when I was president, in 8 years I had 7 Japanese prime ministers. Only one of them, the most politically adroit, Mr. Ibushi, was taken out because he had a stroke. And he was a wonderful man and a gifted leader. But after a decade, they hadn't quite returned to full employment, even though they had spent $2 trillion in modernizing their infrastructure. And it's going to do them a lot of good. In spite of Fukushima, don't count them out, they'll come back. But the point I'm trying to make is, what we Americans are trying to do now is to put America back in the future business and beat the historical odds. We want to get back to full employment, giving young people hope, starting new businesses, and less than 10 years from September the 8th, 15th, 2008, which is when the financial crisis occurred. And I don't think you can do that except through networks of cooperation. Now, let me tell you why I think that. The fundamental characteristic of the 21st century world is its increasing interdependence. Borders look more like nets than walls. That's how come all of you are successful, because you figured out how to accelerate the trend of positive interdependence. But interdependence simply means that divorce is not an option. We can't get away from the rest of the people on earth, no matter how much we might like to. Maybe for an hour or two, but not for a lifetime. If that's true, it is therefore to me clear that we have to be working for a future of shared prosperity and shared responsibilities. And we have to build up the positive forces that bring us together and reduce the negative ones. The negative ones are largely to be found in three categories. The world is too unequal, too unstable, and too unsustainable. It's unequal, and that constrains growth. In America, before the financial meltdown, 90% of the gains of the first decade of the 21st century went to 10% of us, over 40% to the top 1% of us. That constrains growth. You don't have middle class, you don't have incomes going up, you don't have jobs being created, you don't have people moving from poverty into the middle class. I'm proud of the fact that we have the longest peacetime expansion in history and the largest monthly private sector job creation ever. But I'm more proud of the fact that 100 times as many people worked themselves from poverty into the middle class in those 8 years as in the previous 12. See, we have to have some inequality to reward good ideas and hard work and entrepreneurship. It's what makes a market economy work. But if it goes too far, it constrains growth. Same thing is true in the rest of the world. I spend a lot of my life in places that are very poor. Haiti, Africa, East Asia, the poorest parts of Latin America. But intelligence and hard work, I see every day, are evenly distributed. Opportunity is not. The structures of society, which got all of you into these chairs today, are not. So I think about what can be done to create opportunity. Not to take people on top down, but to build people on the bottom up. Second thing is, the world's too unstable. You need instability in a market economy. That's what taking risk is all about. But if you have too much instability, nobody takes any risk and they shut down. That's what happened in America after the financial collapse. For years, American banks have had around $2 trillion in cash uncommitted to loans or unnecessary to hold to cover bad mortgages. The banks only own about $200 billion or so of bad mortgages now, or mortgages that could turn bad. Why wasn't the money being loaned? Because people were scared to borrow and people were scared to loan. Because there was too much instability and it spread across the world in a hurry. It turned out the banks were even more leveraged in mortgages in the UK and Ireland, and it shut things down. And it affected things everywhere. You see that in the continuing threat of terrorism, and you see it in the rising losses from natural disasters, which in the last 2 decades have been 3 times as great as ever before in human history. I just came up here from Central America, where in the last 20 years they've had 5 times as many hurricanes and 3 times as many floods as in any 20-year period before. You want some instability in the system. If there were no instability, there could be no market economy. We would just settle down and, stultify. But if there's too much, things shut down. And finally, I believe that the world we live in is unsustainable because of the way we produce and consume energy and other natural resources. And I could give you lots of examples. The ice cap on Greenland is melting. Why should you care? Because it's 8% of the world's fresh water. If it all melts and goes into the North Atlantic, it could ironically have the impact of warming the rest of the planet, but having Northern Europe, Canada, and the Northeast United States get as cold as it was 700 years ago, in which case some of the most productive economies in the world will be frozen for a few months a year. Big chunks of the South Pole are melting. The Tibetan ice cap is melting. And it's going to disrupt water supplies and a lot of other problems. China today, with all of its growth, has got a huge problem because its whole civilization has been shaped by the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, and the Yellow River is dry at parts of the year. And the Chinese have decided to deal with it by constructing two huge gravity-driven canals from the Yangtze, which Chinese engineers, not Western environmental activists, Chinese engineers fear will dry up both rivers. That in turn will put a lot of pressure on China to take more water out of the Mekong River, which flows into Vietnam, Laos, all the countries in Southeast Asia, which are growing and struggling and doing much better. We normalized relationships with Vietnam in 1995. Their per capita income was $300 a year. In 2010, I went back to celebrate our 15th anniversary. Their per capita income was $1,800 a year, a five-fold increase in just 15 years. All this could be messed up if we don't find a way to continue to grow the economy in a way that uses less destructive energy patterns. So I spend an enormous amount of my time trying to figure out how we can do all these things and make them good economics. Because particularly in this time of global economic insecurity, we can't solve these problems by asking people to defer for 20 years their own dreams of earning a decent income, having a decent job, starting a business, giving their own children a better chance. There's a big difference between how you deal with these problems in poor countries and rich countries. Poor countries need systems, either traditional systems or ways to get around them. And that's where you come in. In 2010, a UN report said that wireless technology becoming a common medium has done more to lift people out of poverty than any other technological advance in history. That in the poorest countries in the world, every 10% increase in cell phone penetration tends to add almost 1% a year to GDP growth. It's a stunning thing. I remember when we were trying to rebuild, first President Bush and I were working on rebuilding the Southeast Asian countries after the tsunami. And then I stayed on for 2 years to work for the UN. We had all these widows whose husbands had been fishermen. And the ones who wanted to do something else, we trained to do other things. The ones who wanted to go back to sea, as their husbands had done, we had to replace their boats. We found out that if we gave every one of them a cell phone, they could immediately find out what the prevailing price of fish was 10 miles away, 20 miles away, 30 miles away, and the cell phone increased their income 30 to 50% over a year. It's stunning, and there are lots of other examples. Take Haiti, where I'm working now. In 2011, only 10% of the Haitians had a bank account. And Haiti had they didn't even make loans, the banks didn't. They got 20% of the country's income from remittances from Haitians working in the U.S. and Canada and France and the Caribbean. And so the banks could make plenty of money just converting the dollars and francs, Canadian bucks, back into Haitian currency. They take a fee. They made plenty of money. But it didn't help the ordinary Haitians. It didn't do anything to affect the fact that 70% of them were living on less than $2 a day before the earthquake. So what happened? Well, 80% of the Haitians already had access to a cell phone. So the chairman of Digicel, an Irish businessman named Dennis O'Brien, is one of our partners in Haiti and in the Clinton Global Initiative network of Haitian friends. Did a lot of work with the Canadian bank, Scotiabank, to provide a service where Haitians could get cash withdrawals, deposits, and person-to-person transfers using their mobile phones without a bank account. So your industry, in effect, created an alternative system which enabled finance to begin to grow there. Another CGI member runs a company called Sproxel, which lets people in Africa use cell phones to text the code on the medication they have to see if it's counterfeit or not. It's a huge problem in Nigeria, the biggest country in sub-Saharan Africa. They have this huge problem with fake drugs. Well, because they have a cell phone, they can find out if they're real or not. So your technology created an alternative healthcare system to allow individuals in the poorest places in the world to validate the integrity of their medicine. Ericsson, with the UN and Delta Partners, a big investment firm, and an NGO called Refugees United, is helping refugee families that are separated from their loved ones because of conflict find one another. Less than 2% of the people in Africa have access to a computer today, but 45% of them already have cell phones. So now we've got 50,000 refugees living all over the world because of cell phones involved in searches for their relatives, and a lot of them are finding them. Now, there are also some traditional things that have to be done. President Bush and I and Carlos Slim, the Mexican telecom billionaire, and a Canadian philanthropist named Frank Schuster set up these funds to give Haiti the first mortgage system it ever had, because the banks had no incentive to issue mortgages. They have exactly the reverse problem that we had in America. We had too many mortgages. Subprime mortgages, securities out of mortgages. There, you see all these houses that look like they've been abandoned. They haven't been abandoned. They belong to middle and upper middle class people who got a piece of property and started building their houses, but they have to pay for it 100% up front before it can be finished and moved in. Now, there's a mortgage system. We set up the first small business loan system. Small businesses were paying 45 to 60% interest. Nobody can grow a small business paying that kind of interest. So President Bush and I set up a small business loan fund, charging people about 7% interest. Everybody's paying back, we're making money, and we're going to leave them a bank that works. Now, what's the point of all that? In every case, you have cooperation between at least a willing government, the private sector, and often a non-governmental organization, creating a cooperative network. And they got a job to do, so nobody has any time to argue about politics. And that's what you have to do in poor countries, with education, with energy, with governmental capacity. You have to build these systems. Rich countries in trouble today in this crisis, including ours, have the reverse problem. We've got great systems. That's how we all got here. You'd be surprised, for example, if like me, you're older and you don't see so well, if those screens went dark, or if the microphone failed, or the lights went out, or if, God forbid, the air conditioning should fail and all this hot air I'm putting out makes you uncomfortable. If you get bored with my speech, you can get up and go to the restroom or drink a glass of water. I spent a lot of my life in places where none of that can be taken for granted. We have that. But what always happens in developed societies is that the systems which make the country great get too rigid. And public and private, people get more interested in holding on to what they got than creating a bigger future for their children. It's as old as society itself, and it's human nature. So we have to be engaged in this process of reform. And that, too, is really important. So in 1999, when, for example, I signed the Wireless Communication and Public Safety Act, which made 9/11 the universal emergency number. Now it works everywhere. Wireless is going to play a huge role in trying to bring American healthcare costs in line with that of our competitors while maintaining access to quality care in remote places that don't have traditional health care. People debate all the time, and we're not going to have a question and answer session, but whether this new health care law is good or bad. The truth is, in my opinion, and I spent a lifetime studying this, it does a lot more good than bad, but it's not perfect. But it provides a means of continuous reform. We're spending 18% of our income almost on health care. No other rich country in the world spends more than 12. That's the Netherlands. And they have an individual mandate. And that's all they've got. They don't have Medicare, Medicaid, anything like that. They've got an individual mandate, and the people who can't afford to get a subsidy. France is the most expensive big country. They're at 11.8 of their income. That's $1 trillion a year we're spending on health care. We wouldn't spend if we had any other country's health system. And they insure 100% of the people, we insure 86%. Also, once you have a mandate for everybody to be covered, you save a ton of money because you don't have all this cost shifting and all the paperwork costs that go with it. Take Massachusetts, where Governor Romney signed that health care bill that I regret he's had to renounce because it actually has done a lot of good. Health care in Massachusetts is good, but expensive. It's the 7th most expensive system in the country. But before the individual mandate was signed, it was the 2nd most expensive in the country, which is why 75% of the people who live there support the system they've got, because they know their inflation in health care costs has been much lower than the rest of us pay, because once you stop asserting the right to get sick or be in an accident and have everybody else pay for it, and everybody kicks in something, you stop all that cost shifting and it holds cost down. The point I'm trying to make is this. Once there are incentives to improve the system, it tends to make the partisan differences go away. The first bill Congress passed in health care after that law was signed was an overwhelming bipartisan majority bill designed to clean up one of the worst flaws in the bill, which it had reporting requirements for small business that were entirely too onerous and didn't make any sense. You know, it was a big bill, it dealt with a lot of stuff, they messed it up. But once there was a bill in place, there was enormous pressure on people in both parties to do the right thing, to cooperate to fix the problem, and they did. And that's what tends to work in big countries as well. And let me just give you some examples. And from both long-rich countries, that's Europe and Canada and the United States and Japan, and newly rich countries, especially Brazil. And I'll give you one example from a middle-income country that most people don't know much about, where I was last night until I got in here at 2 o'clock this morning, Costa Rica. That proves that what works best is cooperation. If you look at the United States, there are centers of prosperity in this country where if you just spent your time there, you'd be hard-pressed to know that we ever had a crisis. And without exception, there are places of creative, cooperative networks. Silicon Valley's back. You know, everybody said that the tech bubble was a terrible thing and it burst and how awful it was. And you're living proof that it wasn't the tulip bubble in Holland, and it certainly wasn't the mortgage crisis. What happened was some stocks got overvalued because between 1997 and 1999, information technology utilization increased, get this, by 500% a year. So a lot of people went out and made massive investments, including non-wireless IT investments, premised on a growth trend that couldn't continue. So when the tech bubble burst, what really happened? IT usage dropped from a 500% a year increase to a 50% a year increase. Is there any other sector of the American, the Japanese, the European economy that would not kill for 50% of your growth? So they're back in business. I was there the other night for a dinner, and it was astonishing talking to these people about their interest in new energy technologies and new things that they're doing. And I realized when I got up from the dinner, except for the third of the people I knew before I sat down, I had no idea whether I was talking to Republicans or Democrats. They're interested in where the world's going and how to get us there in a hurry, and how many jobs can be created and how much growth can be created. But I'll give you some more examples you may not know about. Do you know what city in America has the largest number of Nobel Prize-winning scientists? San Diego. Used to be a naval city. Still is. They got a great port there. The Navy's got a lot of presence there. But it is now the capital of America's human genome research. It's the biological capital of the United States. Why? Because Craig Venter, who pioneered the private sector efforts to sequence the human genome, has set up a massive foundation to invest in it. Because the government is spending money in research there. Because nobody can see a genome, so you got to have computers. And Qualcomm is headquartered there, but there are now 700 other computer companies based in San Diego. And the University of San Diego, California, San Diego, and California State, San Diego, are supplying a steady stream of trained people to work at all these companies. There were 60,000 applications for the freshman class at the University of California, San Diego this year, driving their acceptance rate down to about 10%, which is about what it is at Harvard and MIT. Right? And you can go to San Diego and talk to people, and they don't have time to talk about fighting. They're all working together. The public sector, the private sector. There's a Republican mayor and a bunch of people. The head of Qualcomm is a big Democrat, and nobody cares. They're too busy trying to build the future with a non-governmental organization, the big foundation, the government, and the private sector. Orlando, my favorite example. Orlando is the computer simulation capital of America. There are 100 computer simulation companies in Florida, in Orlando. Now, like every place in Florida, they were hurt by the mortgage collapse, and they have poor people. They don't have a perfect environment, but they are rolling. Why? Because the government spends $5 billion of your money a year there on computer simulation, NASA and the Defense Department, because it's a lot cheaper and a lot safer to teach people to drive tanks, fly jet airplanes, and send up spaceships on simulators than the real deal. But you know who their partners are? Disney World, Universal Theme Park, and the video game division of Global Entertainment Arts. They all need computer simulators too, right? If you ever took your kid to Disney World, or if you have done so, or to the Universal Theme Park, you see how important computer simulation is for the kids. And if, like me, you have ever been addicted to a video game, you know that maintaining the constant state of attention deficit disorder required to get people to fanatically throw themselves into these games requires good computer simulation. And the more you got, the more interesting it is. The University of Central Florida in Orlando has become America's least known great university. It has 53,000 students. And every semester they change the curriculum to feed all these companies. The computer simulation companies are big, well-known companies that serve the defense industry and lots of startups. And they can hire professors who then can license their discoveries to new companies, earn the money back for the university, which they can put into more research. Thanks to one of the great bipartisan achievements of the last 50 years, a 1980 law passed with overwhelming bipartisan support that says if the federal government funds research at a university and they come up with a commercially viable idea, they can license it to a private company, keep the money, and put it into more research. The technology corridor in Massachusetts, where it's more costly to do business, is roaring back. Why? Because MIT, in my opinion, has the best technology transfer program in the country. If a professor at MIT comes up with a high-tech idea that he or she believes has commercial viability and they license it to a company, they don't take any money. not 1 red cent. They want to keep the barriers to entry low. They want to keep the initial cost of doing business low. So if they give you an idea and it goes bust, you haven't paid for it. They take a piece of the company so that if you hit the jackpot, they get to ride the escalator up. It is working. And the same thing is true in my favorite rising economy, Brazil. And I want you to imagine a situation like this occurring in Washington, D.C. today. Brazil is the most environmentally responsible big country in the world. But they have big responsibilities that are almost impossible to shoulder. The Amazon rainforest contributes 20% of all the oxygen we get on planet Earth from non-ocean sources. And it has thousands and thousands of unique plant and animal species that may contain the answer to how to deal with all kinds of cancers and other medical problems. Under the previous president, Mr. Lula, they cut destruction of the rainforest by 75%, reduced poverty by paying the poorest families to send their kids to school and to the doctor to get annual health insurance, and diversified their economy, all at the same time. Now, inequality was going up in America, it was going down in Brazil. And he did it fiscally responsibly to keep inflation down. But now they got 2 huge problems. They're growing like crazy, and they need more power. Roughly 80% of their power was from hydroelectric power. And the only places in Brazil now where the rivers run deep and hard enough to generate electricity are in the rainforest. There are 3 projects pending. The biggest one would take down a lot of the rainforest and destroy the livelihood of a 100-year-old native tribe, which is protected by law and which maintains the rainforest in its pristine condition. So what are they supposed to do? Their other big problem is this. Brazil is the only country in the world that is now entering the 5th year of its boom, where they use more biofuel made from sugarcane than gasoline. So even though they've got oil sources off the coast of Brazil, they don't use them much. They can sell them all. And cane-based ethanol is way the best in the world. American corn ethanol, you get about 2.8 gallons of ethanol for every gallon of gasoline required to produce it. Brazil, 9.3 to 1. So they want to do more of this, right? And sugarcane does not take the rainforest in. They need deep, deep topsoil, and the rainforest topsoil is about that thick. But the problem is, the more of the topsoil they take, the more they push the soybean farmers, which don't need topsoil. They have little bitty root structures. And the cattle ranchers into the rainforest. So they got the commercial timber companies out, now they got to worry about this. So what should they do? The answer is not important. The process is. I went to Manaus in Brazil last year. My foundation does a lot of work helping cities convert their transit systems, their lighting programs, close their landfills and turn them into power sources. So they asked me to come down there, and they said, we're really worried about this. What should we do? And I go to this meeting. It was unbelievable. They had every major chamber of commerce represented, all the oil companies, all the utility companies, all the cane producers, people representing the native Indian tribes, the head of the Green Party who ran 3rd in the race for president last time. In other words, a whole political spectrum. And instead of having a food fight, they're sitting around tables talking to each other like they have good sense and recognizing that this is a high-class problem. Their country at long last is getting really prosperous, but they have really complicated problems. And they want to know how they should deal with this together. And they recognize there is no perfect solution. Last night, I was in Costa Rica. That's why I didn't get here until 2 o'clock in the morning. Now here's main thing you need to know about Costa Rica is it was just another poor Central American country until about 60 years ago, when they made a decision that they would adopt a democratic system of majority rule and minority rights in cooperative decision-making, and they're the only country in Latin America that in 60 years has never abandoned it. Then about 40 years ago, they decided they were going to be poor forever if all they did was export a couple of agricultural products. So they decided to adopt a free market approach and try to diversify their economy and take more imports in and change things. Then they decided that Central America was being killed by all these wars and this massive military expenditures, and they decided they'd be the first country in the world without an army. So they have a police force and a coast guard to help them deal with narco trafficking, and that's it. And they put all the money into education and health care and investment for development. So every little village, no matter how poor, has a good, clean school. And they've got some kind of health care network that reaches every citizen of the country. And then they decided that their most important resource was their stunning biodiversity, and 26% of the country is now protected as a national park. They have volcanoes and rainforests, 26%. In the last decade, when everybody else was reeling from all these economic crises, they increased their forest cover to 51% of the country. They pay the farmers to produce food on some land and to reforest on others. 92% of their electricity is generated by hydropower. It's not a perfect country. They still have inequality. They still have allegations of corruption. They still have too much of the economy in the informal sector that's not part of the regular lawful life of the country. It's not perfect. But the per capita income in Costa Rica is light years higher than any other country in Central America, because they made a decision to share the future and to make decisions together. Business, government, NGOs. They made a decision that they would take a totally different path. Yesterday I met a young guy from Florida who runs a private resort on the edge of one of the rainforests. He bought it all for $120,000 20 years ago. And he just slowly built it up. Now he's got one by one of the volcanoes. And he said, you know, this is the most amazing country in the world. These people have figured out that they can grow the economy more by having a diversified economic base and by being the clean energy capital of the world. They also have attracted lots of investment from Silicon Valley, and this year, 40% of their exports are high-tech exports. So, what's the point of all this? Cooperation in the modern world works better than conflict. Diversity of opinion and argument is good, but in the end, the goal has to be cooperation and containment of problems, not constant conflict. Final example. One of my partners in the Clinton Global Initiative is an international network of business schools called the HULT Business Schools, H-U-L-T. They have business schools all over the world. And their commitment to our process was that they would have a global competition from business and economics departments all over the world, not just their schools, anywhere, to figure out actually how to solve the problems we're dealing with. And they give $1 million prize to the winner. This year they did 3. One was, how do you take the Habitat for Humanity model, which has become famous in America largely through President Carter's efforts, and do 1 million houses a year since you don't have that many volunteers. One was, how do you take the one laptop per child goal of the UN and give it to 20 million kids within a year? Because that's the only way to deal with the fact that it's not just 100 million kids in the world who don't go to school. There's another couple 100 million who go to school, but they don't have trained teachers who access the learning materials. The third was, how do you take distributed, decentralized solar power and give it to 20 million people in a year so that you can bring electricity and light and economic activity and students studying at night and parents working at night to places that are very remote. Here's the point. The winner of the energy thing, and it's just like business school. You write up a case study recommending a course of action. The winner of the energy contest was a team from New York University. Not in New York, but in Abu Dhabi in the Middle East. And I have to make full disclosure, my daughter works for New York University and helped them set up the university, so I'm doing a little home cooking here. But here's the interesting thing. Not a single member of the team was from the Middle East. There was one student from India and one from Pakistan. One student from China and one from Taiwan. In the world we live in, India and Pakistan seem condemned forever to be at odds. If they cooperated, they could grow as fast in the Indian subcontinent as China. In the world we live in, we see China and Taiwan being at odds, even though more than 10 million Chinese work in companies owned by people in Taiwan. These kids could have cared less. And I said to them when I brought them up, I don't know whether we want these pictures in the hometown paper or not. But the point is, they were living in tomorrow, not yesterday. That's all we have to do in America. Our workforce is younger than Europe, younger than Japan. In 20 years, it'll be younger than China. Because of immigration. Look at this crowd. If we'd had a meeting like this 30 years ago, it would not be nearly as diverse. It'd be mostly old gray-haired white guys like me. I'm delighted to see that my demographic has not been entirely eliminated from this audience. But it's true, isn't it? And having lost it, I can tell you, youth matters. Demographics determine the destiny of a country. So if we get back in the future business, if we adopt a way of saying we want partisan differences, we want differences of opinion, but our goal is creative cooperation, we're going to be fine. It's what's working in America today, it's what's working all over the world, and it's what the wireless industry has helped to make possible on a scale unprecedented in human history. All we have to do is to infect the rest of our common life with the same sort of decision making. Thank you very much.
It's truly inspirational to think about all the good we're doing and can do because of our commitment to innovation. I also want to thank you for being with us, and I look forward to seeing you in San Diego, October 9th through the 11th for CTIA Enterprise and Applications. Have a safe flight home and a good afternoon. Thank you.